should tell you about my suit first. Maybe you care about that. Maybe you don't. The first thing you need to know is these are tiny Elon Musk heads. And this is a Twitter suit. In the lining here, there's a bunch of comments from Twitter about another suit this company made for me. This company is LGFG. And they came to me a couple of months ago and asked me if I wanted them to make me some suits, one for each of the rules from 12 Rules for Life. And they sent a little deck of creative ideas, and they were very creative. And so I thought, well, sure, why not? And so they've been working extremely hard and extremely creatively to make me these crazy suits. And so it's been kind of fun to wear them. Turns out I like this. I didn't think I would necessarily, this kind of powder blue with beige, but it seems to be real nice. So it's fun.
Yes, it's fun. Hello, welcome. Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, Matt. You got your Twitter suit?
You know, I haven't worn a suit in some time. That also correlates correlates to me being employed for quite some time, which is, my job hunt. Actually, I wore a suit more when I was unemployed than when I was employed. Funny how that works.
How it goes.
How are you doing, David?
I'm not bad. Stoked for today. Still coming back off of this cold I had last week, but feeling
David's
good. Happy to be back.
The weather, but as far as we know, it's not COVID. Although there's certain things you say that make it sound like it was something.
I think it's cedar fever, but yeah, I'm still negative. I'm on the mend. I just feel my voice is off, but appreciate everyone. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving, Lord in heaven, Christmas and New Year's. I had a pretty good time, apart from Texas just completely imploding against Washington, which was not fun.
Oh, that happened.
I had a meltdown on Twitter. I probably put out like 15 tweets about the state of the program at like midnight.
I missed that entirely. When was that? What was that on New Year's?
Well, it was the 29th.
Okay.
That was Thursday last week. But
that's funny. Yeah, I actually went out on Christmas and stayed in on New Year's. Nice. And interesting sort of gangs of people you see out on Christmas at bars. It was fun. But David, I don't want to skirt past what we just saw with Jordan Peterson. Sure. And there's a few things that I want to like kind of touch on. There's this Twitter war going on about, do young men need role models? And it rhymes with conversations we have, but I do think like part of it is lost when it becomes like, do they need to watch a better streamer, or just streamers need to court them better? And I think there's a few things that I do think need to be kept in mind just where we are. And one is was mentioned by Patrick Fenelon on Twitter, which is this Pew poll. U.S. Republican vote share by age within each generation relative to national average. Like, millennials are very not Republican, and I don't think this is because of us. I would love to take credit for it. I do think it is true that it's probably never been easier to find more models of masculinity than ever before. So like, I actually think like part of the problem is part of the solution people want is happening or has happened. But I think it's mainly because we haven't been able to, cash in on capitalism the way previous generations have and see the benefit of, owning things being the main source of your income. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say, but I also think if you do have a wayward youth, young man or young woman, patreon.com/left reckoning, and we'll sort you right
out. No, I mean, I don't know. Have we made this public yet? But we had Kuba on the show recently where we watched The End of Men. We should put that out there for folks for a more in-depth look at some of the things that we're talking about, because like, I think there's a couple things that can be true at the same time. One, people always are like, well, what the left really needs is like the left-wing Jordan Peterson. It's like, fine. I mean, it'd be nice if you had somebody who had like a big following who was trying to promote, being part of a collective and recognizing the power that we have when we sort of lock arms together. And, speaking to some of the anxieties that come with being young in this country. I think that wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
But I think sometimes you miss the current moment when you think that the reason the right has been able to make inroads is because they're doing that. The right does this because they recognize, just like we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes with the GOP, they recognize that people are alienated. They
Right.
recognize that there's a lot of despair in the society. So they try to speak to the despair and then promote their own kind of BS reasons why it is, right? So if
Mhm.
it's the GOP more broadly, it's the decline in living standards for working class people in this country, and they blame not capitalism, immigration, blah, blah, blah. The right does the same thing with young men. People feel very alienated, very alone, very atomized,
Yep.
and they say, "Well, it's because woke feminism is ruining society." And I think that if we want to be serious about building, winning politics, we have to be able to speak to the atomization that folks are feeling. And should be uncomfortable with that, but again, not mistaking the fact that like the right's there as them building some kind of not even just positive project in the sense of like the left, in the sense of like them actually like recruiting people. Because like if you watch, I'll put this out tomorrow. We should have put it out already,
Yeah.
but if you watch our conversation on masculinity and the left with Cuba, one thing that's very notable about all these right wing outlets is that what they tell you to do is work on yourself, which I think a lot of people should work on themselves. I don't think that's a bad thing. Being
Yeah.
fit and healthy is a good thing. Recognizing where your sort of limits are and where you can push past them is a good thing. I do think that on the left, sometimes people are very, very worried about talking about that kind of thing. I don't think that that's a good tendency that we have on our side.
Right.
But if you watch the right
Yeah,
wing,
can I just jump in there, like, and just to like characterize it a little bit, which is like this idea that you say like these young men are choosing this because of X and Y structural political reason, and it's like, yeah, that's true, but why are the other ones not? Right? Like,
Mhm.
right, like you can't just like naturalize it to the point where it becomes like, well, what's the point of anything? Like there's like I think it is too like negative, almost too like alarmist often when people look at this.
But I would also, just, adding to that though, it's like if you watch the right wing stuff, what they always tell you is, they don't tell you to really go out and be a part of society. Like if the problem is that you're
Yeah.
lonely and atomized, right? They'd say, well, the reason for that is that you're fat, or you're not interested, and you haven't read um, um, 12 rules for life or whatever. Um, and if you're not getting the results that you want, well, you need to watch more seminars, you need to get more supplements, you need to be more and more enmeshed in this kind of right wing online individual sitting by yourself alone matrix. So you see that there's no real solution there. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, like it's if I were just to say one thing, and this isn't supposed to be a segment or anything like that, but if I were just to say one thing, is that like one thing I do worry about and I do see on the left is something I talk with Michael a lot about, is that there's a very large cultural side to the movement. I'm not talking about culture politics or anything like that. I'm talking about like the stuff that people are into, like what they like to consume when it comes to like art and media and things like that. There's a version of that that's dominant. And a lot of that just has to do with this like young people culture, right? These are just like things that young people are interested in. But we should be able to be a little bit broader in our scope, in our outreach, not just to everybody in society, but particularly young people, because, there is a kind of humor, there are kinds of TV shows, kinds of music and things like that that I think sort of dominate and create an air that like if you're not one of those people who's like into that kind of shit, you're not welcome there. I don't know if that was just my experience, because when I was in my early 20s, I was in DC and New York, and maybe culturally, because it's a different part of the country, I felt very alienated sometimes. I don't know, it's just like I think that like what's been frustrating to me about that whole thing that we've seen over the past couple of days has been, when it's like, no, people don't need to be fucking watching Vouch to like learn how to be a man. I think that that's a pretty disastrous.
Yeah, and Bausch doesn't need to like change his like content particularly to like meet them, like, and like show them like how to meet women. Like I like if like, yeah, go, sorry, I cut you off. Go on,
No,
David.
I mean, I was just going to say, but what has been frustrating to me is that there does seem to be, again, not that it's all like misplaced, but there does seem to be like a real push back against like the idea even of like trying to make parts of being a socialist more attractive to people who aren't already sort of pulled into the kind of cultural web that I think does push people in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate thing is like it's a spiritual response ultimately. And like fundamentally, like, look, Jordan Peterson listeners, what young men, like you're a 16-year-old Jordan Peterson, what you need to hear is, bro, you made a fucking wrong choice. And you need to put that shit in reverse because it's going to fuck you up. You're going to be wearing Elon Musk ties. Yeah. I kind of lost my train of thought there. Thinking about.
Well, anyway, I mean, just on this, we'll put it up tomorrow for people who aren't patrons, but you should be a patron. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. If you didn't see the conversation we had with Kuba on the end of men, and this kind of right wing push that the crisis of masculinity is going to be solved with ball tanning. You can hear maybe some more well-formed thoughts on the subject.
Yeah. It brought me back to my dark period of being unemployed and trying to date at the same time. Like those are the things like that is difficult, right? Like those things but that's like, it's very economic and not because, check that out, folks. I forgot how and relevant that conversation is.
I realized midstream. Well, we got a fun show coming up. We're gonna be joined by Branko Marcetic, who's one of my favorite writers at Jacobin, on to talk a bit about the Twitter files. We talked about Matt Taibbi, and I think the right analysis of how that very much, in my opinion, was like journalism malpractice.
Yeah.
But I think in the past few weeks, there has been a sort of overreaction where people have sort of recognized it's like, oh, well, this is being released in a certain way and by certain people to serve a certain purpose. Therefore, all the stuff that's coming out shouldn't alarm you or be of interest to you. And to me, I'm sorry, folks. Maybe I'm just an old lefty from way back. But when I hear that the FBI is trying to play a major role in content moderation, I get a little worried. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What's really in there that I think has sort of been missed, I think both nationally, but I think more consequentially by those of us on the left as well.
Yeah, and I am not there. It's not out of protest. I really appreciate Branko's writing on the topic. I still think and I don't think Branko's disagreeing with this, but like the way even the Fong, which I agree with David, is the first, I think, semblance of journalism that came out of that whole thing. You still have to say like this was done in conjunction with the lawyer. But that said, I also agree with the point Branko made in this interview, which is, it's a big shame the way that it's been rolled out, because it does seem sort of tailor-made to leave the people who it's, I think, frankly, most relevant to completely dismiss any of the things that are revealed to folks, whether it's opportunistic or not, for like a fucking loser like Elon Musk. And it does remind me of Death is Just Around the Corner, one of my favorite podcasts on the JFK conspiracy stuff, is how that recent Tucker Carlson shit and them sort of, and the Candace Owens scene of like, oh, the CIA basically just admitted it, and we're all going to be like that. It's poisoning the well. And so like I was glad that we had Branko on for this.
And I reckon that, man. I'm probably going to have a little bit more to say about it after the that goes on. But before we get to the Twitter conversation, Matt, I did want to open up the show starting out 2023, trying to think a little bit more seriously about the grand old party, the Republican Party in this country. Because we've seen today in pretty spectacular fashion, that party failed to elect a Speaker of the House. I think it's very likely that they'll be able to pull one out, though I don't follow congressional inside politics close enough to have any kind of prediction about what's going to happen.
I follow it vaguely closer, and also no idea. Who knows? I hope Herschel Walker. I think Herschel Walker should get to be the speaker. That's who I'd vote for.
And as Ben reminds us really quick before we jump into that, we should remind folks that we're going to be in New York City in just a couple of weeks. Matt was already there, but I'll be joining him January 22nd at the Cutting Room with our friends Ben Burgess, Jason Miles, Sam Cedar, Emma Vigland. and Bhaskar Sin Kara. It's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. Y'all can get tickets. There's links below in the show notes. So make sure that you come and join us for that. But let's get to this opener, Matt, because so we've seen the GOP, implosion on this question. But I want to talk about something else that we've seen since, this new Congress is set to start, which is the fact that one of the first things that the GOP has promised to do is to undermine the Congressional Staffers Union. And it's really egregious. And for people who aren't familiar, this was a huge fight for congressional staffers who, this is one of those things that I don't think gets a lot of play with folks because they don't understand those dynamics, but are incredibly overworked, are paid pennies to the dollar for what they're actually producing. They're abused by their congressional employers regularly, and it also creates a situation where getting a job in politics really becomes something that you have to have money to do, because despite the prestige that might come with saying, I work on the Hill, I'm a congressional staffer, the salary doesn't match with that. Which means that it's rich kids who end up becoming some of the most influential people in American politics. And most of these Congress people don't know, for example, what's on all these bills. So the people who are feeding them information have a lot of power and influence. And it creates this dynamic where the door is very much shut to working class people, despite their credentials to get into that position. So they won this fight to get a union there. And this new GOP Congress is trying to undermine that as one of their first acts.
Yeah, I just wanted to, what you mentioned just kind of set this off. Have you seen this Maxwell Frost thing? This RNC Research, Florida Democrat Congressman-elect Maxwell Frost, whose salary as a member of Congress will be $1,700, says he's probably just gonna have to couch surf for a bit. Everyone's crazy that it's difficult to attain housing or something like that. DC is a very expensive city. But anyway, sorry, I jumped in.
No. I mean, it is a very expensive city, and this was a hard won fight. The question about whether or not they'll be able to do this is still up in the air. I know David Dayen was saying they probably don't have the authority or a real pathway to doing it. But regardless of that fight, which I think is important, something we should highlight solidarity with the Congressional Staffers Union.
Yeah.
I think it really highlights something about the GOP, which I know our audience already knows, but I want to talk about it a little bit more theoretically, is that the GOP is not a working class party. And neither is the Democratic Party. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. But there's been this narrative that the GOP is more and more, turning its attention to working class people's issues. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I think the fact that they're already trying to undermine people's rights to collectively bargain shows that. Both the Republicans and the Democratic Party locked arms when the railroad unions were trying to fight for a better contract and denied them their democratic rights to strike. And you're seeing it again play out with the GOP. So all of this kind of talk is nonsense. But just because neither parties are quote unquote workers' parties doesn't mean that these parties aren't interested in the distribution of resources. And I think sometimes, we talk about the GOP and we recognize that it represents a far right movement. It represents a nativist movement. It represents a racist movement. It represents a movement that is against workers' rights and regulations and all that kind of stuff. And they miss sort of what the social base of the Republican Party is. And I think to understand this, you have to look at the social base of what the Republican Party is. The Republican Party is a party that is made up of small town, small time landowners, small time capitalists, to use Marxist terms, petit bourgeois, who are interested in things like distributive policies from the state. Think about things like PPP loans. They love that shit. As we've loved to point out the hypocrisy of all these kind of right-wing Trumpers who get worked up about people fighting for minimum wage increases who somehow got $1 million from the state forgiven. They love redistributive policies as long as it's going to them. You see it again in tax breaks and farm subsidies. The Democratic Party operates under a similar logic too. It just has a different social base. Both of these parties are parties that look out for elite interests, but their social base is different. And let me just pull this up. This is from an excellent piece from 2020 called "The Fault Lines" by Dylan Riley in the New Left Review. And he writes here, the types of redistributions redistribution that appeal to the Republican mass base differ from those demanded by the Democrats. Republicans are oriented to forms of state largesse like farm subsidies, handouts to small businesses, and protectionist trade tariffs. In place of credentialing, the Republican base demands other forms of social closure based on race, nationality, citizenship status. Accordingly, they demand restrictions on immigration and a general defense of borders, citizenship, measures that enable redistribution within the native population alone. In sum, both parties are redistributive coalitions engaged in a zero-sum struggle using political mechanisms to transfer income to their constituents, both at elite and mass levels. In conditions of slowing growth, U.S. politics has become frozen in a highly polarized pattern with little possibility of a definitive breakthrough on either side within the framework of the existing electoral state system. And I think being able to understand this kind of thing as socialists and Marxists is really crucial, because I think a lot of people, and it's understandable, they might prefer a Biden over a Trump. But they sometimes, I think, miss the fact that these are both ruling class parties that are interested in redistributing resources and power and wealth to different parts of the American ruling class and the American elite. And where you really start to see this is in terms of like voter data, is in terms of college education, right? And college education in this country has been used as a stand-in for class, which can be sort of helpful. Like, honestly, if you're trying to do like real meta level data analysis, probably is a pretty decent tool to use. It might not be the Marxist analysis, but you see why people utilize it. So I'm not saying that you should never use that, but it, again, obscures some of these very clear dynamics, because, you know, you can create the situation where you think, well, people who don't have a college education are necessarily working class, which is not true in a lot of cases. And the Republican base is not necessarily this kind of grouping of, you know, forgotten working class people. These are different groups, and they're trying to get rewards in material ways from these different parties. But this is something that's very, very different from like class politics. At this point, I think it's undeniable from a political science standpoint that you can see two very wildly different Americas politically relating to whether or not somebody has a college degree or not. But a degree cannot be used as a placeholder for class. Because even if you see the division between GOP and Democratic voters on education status, there are even bigger divisions in the Democratic Party, for example, between people who support more Bernie Sanders styles politics versus Joe Biden. Well, you know, the Bernie Sanders coalition was made up of a lot of people who might have a BA, but not people who have these more professional degrees and therefore probably are getting higher amounts of income. You know, Sanders really got a lot of his support from these kind of BA holders who were working these quote unquote like low status jobs. A lot of people on the left have gotten really caught up in this debate about the PMC, the professional managerial class. And I don't want to wade into all that too much right now, but I think it's absolutely critical to note that among low status degree holders, right, people who do the vast majority of labor in white collar, which is again a very antiquated term now, work, are increasingly becoming more and more proletarianized, meaning that the security and abundance that they might have had with a college job in the 60s and 70s has been evaporating. And that's just looking at people who have those jobs, which is not the vast majority of them. We now see in our generation that the promise of a college job, college education has not really lived up to the expectations. So the question about politics really becomes, which way will that group go? Marx used to chide the middle class, right? But always with this kind of and also remember, this is like in the 1800s. So we're talking about the middle class, very different from how we used the middle class in America to sort of represent people even on the higher end of like the wage labor spectrum. But anyways, Marx used to chide the middle class, but always with this expectation that sooner or later they would line up with a proletarian political movement. Capital has been really devious in the United States and Western Europe, trying to tie more and more of people's life into the needs of the market. Very small pie compared to capitalists, but significant to you. And what I mean by that is like you see home ownership become something that becomes a financial product, right? Something that seems out of reach to all of us, but something that used to be sort of the hallmark of a good union job is that you could buy a house. Well, that becomes something that becomes a financial product. So then it does matter to you if these policies are sort of beneficial to the capitalist markets in the United States. Even if you have a very small sliver, it's something that matters to you. 401ks, the way that a lot of people's retirements are set up, also do this. Very, very small portion compared to the capitalist class in this country, but enough to make you care.
Yep.
So capital has done a really good job at trying to wedge divisions between wage workers in this country. People who have to sell their labor in order to survive, between people on the higher end of that wage spectrum and people at the lower end of this wage spectrum as well. So, excuse me. So what we see with the GOP is that they are speaking to certain kinds of anxieties and realities of working people in this country: deindustrialization, globalization, neoliberalism. But of course, their solutions are always, wage war on immigrants, lower taxes, protect the wealthy. But they speak to folks. And what happens in a country like the United States, where you don't have class politics, right? You don't have like a working class party, is politics becomes very, very incoherent and strange, where you do have sections of the working class who might be supporting the GOP. And I think it's really important too, when we're talking about this kind of thing, to remember that the most popular party when it comes to working class voters is none, because working class voters in this country overwhelmingly do not vote. But you see these kind of things as like, what does this mean, right? We're seeing some kind of uptick in working class voters maybe voting for the Republican Party. Is this the Republican Party is becoming a working class party? No, it's that different people have different kinds of needs, and they're trying to get those answered, right? Maybe wrongly or rightly. They're trying to get those answered, and this is the constellation in front of them. It's very incoherent. It purposefully is incoherent. And I think it's really important for us who are trying to build a different kind of politics than just trying to like revitalize the Democratic Party. Have to be able to recognize that the kind of weird system that we have right now is a direct result of neoliberalism and the lack of any kind of real class politics, where people who do have these anxieties don't have a place to go. Because as bad as it is in a state like Texas, one thing that worries me very much is that there's this kind of fixation was like, well, if we can just turn it blue, things will get better. California, has a inequality level similar to Mexico, right? And that's a state that has been controlled by the Democratic Party for a long time. So the point is, we have two elite parties that aren't interested in fighting for working class people. You saw it as clear as you ever will see it when they both locked arms to deny railroad workers their right to collectively bargain and go on strike if need be. And I think understanding the social base as to why there are sections of the ruling class, of the wealthy in this society, who are interested in the Republican Party, and why there are sections of the ruling class who are interested in the Democratic Party, really will help us trying to build out a different kind of political alternative to this. Because you have to recognize that the Democratic Party is interested in looking out for the elites that are in their corner, and the Republican Party is looking out for the elites in their corner. And if we want to build a new kind of class politics, a new kind of politics in this country, we do have to be building up and trying to pull people into, a kind of politics that really does speak to their material needs, speaks the language of universalism, speaks the language of class politics, because it's completely absent. And you're going to see all these kind of weird aberrations and openings for the right wing in its absence.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I really liked about there. One was like the section on Trump, sort of reluctantly. Let me pull this up here. Trump basically being damn it, I had this up. Where Trump's talking about the vaccine. Are we talking about the New Left Review piece here, the 7 Thesis? Because
that's by Dylan Riley too. This is from Fault Lines, but yeah, bring that up, because that's I think a very excellent piece. Some people were chatting a little bit, but I thought it was a very good attempt at like working through what Bidenism is, because it is something that's both unique and more the same. Yeah,
I found this. How then to understand the strange creature? Basically, we'll just go to the very first paragraph here, just to read the thesis of this, because I think it's very interesting. For most of the 20th century, U.S. political parties represented different coalitions of capitalists, and this is like people don't understand. This is like it's important to understand, and this is remedial for some folks, that these are two capitalist parties and what that actually means, and that's
Wait,
right.
really quick, man, not to cut you
Yeah.
off, but like this is one thing that really infuriates me about a lot of like independent left media is that the point of talking about these things for a lot of folks seems to be who should you feel happy about when you see on the TV screen, and who should you be mad about when you see them on the TV screen? Which I think is very different from the project that we're trying to build here. Is like, how do we understand the world that we're in order to try and change it? But anyway.
Right. So for most of the 20th century, U.S. political parties represented different coalitions of capitalists who appealed to working class voters on the basis that they would promote economic development, expand job opportunities, and generate revenues to invest in public goods. This was the material basis of consent that determined party success at the polls. A local version of the politics that shaped most capitalist democracies during the long post-war boom produced significant electoral swings. That political landscape, Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, that political landscape has now disappeared beginning in the 1990s and definitively since 2000. Republican and Democrat rule alternates in narrowest margins. And it's interesting because it talks a little bit about how like the New Deal era wasn't necessarily because of class struggle. It was as much to do with war mobilization, but nonetheless, it led to Keynesianism and that sort of state investment into sort of a capitalist state. And basically, we've undergone a similar sort of thing like that regarding COVID, but it happens in a time of low profitability, which means it's not the same conditions of original like New Deal Keynesianism. And there's this other section here I want to get on to because there's the shift in specifically about workers without a college education. The shift in white workers without college degree to the Republican Party is best understood not as a process of class de-alignment, which is like what people have been trying to posit as for a while, but rather as a consequence of the GOP's successful bid to appeal to the interests of a particular fraction of the working class in nativist and racist terms. The key point is that the segment's move to the Republicans should not be explained in terms of attitudes or prejudices. Rather, those attitudes should be seen as resulting from this class's fraction's objective situation. The organization of the white working class as white or native workers as native is in many ways a rational strategy for workers who have the opportunity to constitute themselves as such in a context where class identity is nowhere evident. And that's the context everyone operates in. By keeping out immigrants and keeping down non-whites, the white working class or native working class seeks to increase the value and attractiveness of its labor power. It's not simply that such a strategy is this is not to imply that such a strategy is based on an accurate analysis or that is likely to succeed. The point is that the policy preferences of the non-college educated are understandably pragmatic without having to attribute to this group a fanaticism which it does not hold. And I think this is like a true way to account for. Am I breaking up?
I'm hearing you. You're coming into me.
Like
So
the Obama voter who then voted Trump, right? Like that seems very clearly.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one thing that I think is really crucial to understand. That like the question is like the way that a lot of liberals like talk about this thing is like, oh, these people are voting against their interests. It's like the bigger question has to be is why are these interests appealing to people rather than folks having like false consciousness or not understanding their circumstances. It's rather to understand why this is appealing to folks if your goal is to try to win different working class groups. And it's a bad thing that these things are appealing to folks. It's not to say that these things are right, but this kind of like they don't understand what's going on. It's like no, they do, and it's a bad logic. It's a bad direction for things to go. It's not an excuse here. But
it's also like the liberal part where it's like this is just about the hate in their hearts and they don't like brown people. Like it reminds me of what the Field sisters say about slavery, which is that it wasn't designed to produce racism. It was designed to produce profits, and racism was a byproduct. Like and I do think like you'll see Tucker Carlson saying this is clearly like we have a culture of supremacy to people who are trying to replace us. Like that stuff is not this, but I think when people are going and motivated by like the wall shit, it was that calculation. It wasn't like I'm superior to these people. It's like I want fucking more money at the end of the pay period, and these people are threatening it, and I'm looking out for me. And that's a different type of it's bad, but it's a different type of thing to understand.
And lastly, like I want to talk just briefly about the point I was making earlier about the proletarianization of this college educated class in this country, because a lot of people get really worked up about this kind of thing. And there are certain aspects of I don't think that people shouldn't take, for example, like a criticism of the left as being too quote unquote PMC lightly, and saying to just ignore it across the board. But I think it's created a very strange reality on the left, where if you look at a lot of the places where there are a lot of union efforts, it is coming, for example, from or even more militancy is coming from teachers, right? It's coming from people who have these kind of degrees, and we should recognize that this is a good thing, actually. Not that the fact that people are suffering and are feeling like they need to fight back in order to survive, but the fact is, like, there has been a militancy amongst this kind of educated class of workers in this country. And I think there's a way that a lot of people sort of react to this in a negative fashion that I think is really unhelpful, because what we have to be doing is building a socialist working class movement that is including and activating this kind of militancy that we are seeing. Because we were on TIR a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the the grad worker strikes that are going on, that have been going on all across the country. And like, one of the things is that university work has become something that's very proletarianized. It used to be something like the intelligentsia used to be considered like a different class, right? Because they're sort of shielded from the ebbs and flows of capitalism, right? And the idea for that is that, like, you want people sort of outside of society to be able to think, so that we can push human knowledge further. Well, that's been shown to be completely nonsensical, because the market realities that we're all under are very much coming to the universities, and this kind of class of folks who maybe in the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, etc., might have been a little bit more shielded from the brutal realities of neoliberal capitalism, aren't anymore. And seeing this as a potential to grow a working class base would be something that the left should embrace, rather than trying to create a dynamic where we're treating everybody with suspicion.
I mean, that drives me crazy. I mean, you saw in the context of all the tech worker layoffs too. It's like, these people make 120,000. Like, yeah, you live in San Francisco. See, like, how lavish of a lifestyle. It's nice, I imagine, more than I make. But like this idea, and that should be like, we should be engendering jealousy of that, as opposed to saying, yeah, everybody should have the health care that those fucking Twitter employees have. Everyone should have like the quality of life and the ability to like maintain their like home and where they live in their community. Like, people should be as empowered as that, yes. But like, this way where it's switched into a faux class politics of like saying, actually, those workers got more than they should have, given X or Y cultural sort of complaint.
Yeah, and like, I will say that, like, it's not that these things are without questions. You saw this was happening a lot when some of the tech union efforts were trying to expand, and I think in a good way, right, to include other people at the facilities. Well, there are sometimes different interests for people who are janitors at a Twitter facility versus employees. But the point is, and you saw that unfortunately negatively happen
with the attention, because nobody gave a fuck on the right. Like, no, like, there was no. It's funny how like the people who are celebrating like XY Twitter engineer getting fired because they made so much for doing whatever. None of those people were like, yeah, fire those janitors, which I thought, like, come on, show the courage of your convictions.
That's true too. I mean, well, the point is that, like, I mean, it's not that there aren't pitfalls when you're trying to build a broad-based working class movement in this country, and the point is to align all those interests together, not to try to find ways to do the work of the right, to do the work of the capitalist class, and trying to drive a further wedge between all these different groups, because it's starting to happen. I don't like the word organically or spontaneously, right?
Yeah.
But there is a lot of mobilization that's happening right now, and like maybe that is the kind of kickstart that's needed. And I don't know, like the thing is, like when you talk about class in America, it's very complicated because we use college education and we use income to define that, which are not the same kind of conceptions as a Marxist one. I think it's very obvious to anyone with a brain that you're living a very different life if you're working for $30,000 a year versus $120,000 a year, regardless of where you are, right?
Or if you went to college.
Or you went
Or
to
if
college.
you went to college, yeah.
But the point of socialist Marxist politics has always been that we live in this very complicated matrix of culture and ideology and history and geography and all these different things that make building a kind of cohesive or coherent political movement difficult. That's why it doesn't typically happen. That's why the strongest political movement in this country, determiner in this country, has always been geography from the get-go in American politics. It's because class politics has been limited. Geography ends up typically being destiny politically. The promise of building a winning movement has always been that there's a reality. Do you work for a wage or do you not work for a wage? That unites people across a lot of different spectrums. And we should be able to embrace that while understanding that there are some of the pitfalls that come with some of these things.
Anyway, and oh, go ahead.
No, I was
just gonna say, in retrospect, that's why the crypto shit also bugged me, because that was a whole thing about how you can make a living without doing any work and just owning shit, and how you too can just own shit for. And it's just wild to me. People don't make the connection that okay, I bought this monkey GIF and then sold it to some other dumbass for $1 million, and now I get to just go order on wage workers in my area for years on this amount of money, and you did nothing. You contributed nothing to society. That's just that's a sickness that we can't recognize that is wrong, just fundamentally. And we don't, because that's the way Elon Musk and all those people make theirs too. So it's like, why? I understand we're democratizing being a leech on society like capitalists are, but yeah.
So I don't know, we'll keep on trying to work through this, because I think that having a stronger contemporary understanding of what the GOP is and what the Democratic Party is, beyond just we think these parties are bad and elite parties, but sort of what is the engine of their political success, and in other cases their failures. I think it's something that's really important for us. If the goal is to try to build a working class party that's separate of these two entities, you got to understand the fucking board if you want to do that, man. Yeah. So hoping to try to build a deeper analysis in 23.
One more thing about this New Left Review piece is, if you want to bring up something before we sort of sidebar onto this, we can. It's this thesis for Democrats' relative success in the 2022 midterms as a reflection of its particular social base. And what's interesting to me is that's something that I was on the Vanguard with Gavin and Zach, and I hinted at this has been something that's on my mind that we're not addressing properly, because everyone talks as if Biden and the Democrats are failing, and they might not be failing, right? He says, given the character of mass bases of the Republican and Democratic parties, it is unsurprising that Democrats now seem to outperform Republicans in midterm elections. They will undoubtedly continue to do so because the Democrats' base, being more educated, is more likely to be engaged in electoral politics. While the GOP currently benefits from from the inequities of the Constitution, Republicans also now have an advantage of being firmly tied to the fraction of the electorate that is less likely to turn out in the midterms, non-college educated whites. In terms of our analysis, Democrats' very success. This isn't the part I was talking about, but they reference everyone acts like the Democrat, but they're kind of winning as the capitalists.
Oh yeah,
and that they seem set up to do that.
What was Bidenism, but a synthesis of parts of the 2012 Obama coalition with suburban voters that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. Right, that's what pulls Biden over the top.
Yes,
particularly in states like Georgia, or even in Texas, even places that he lost. Those inroads have been very attractive to the Democratic Party. One, because functionally that's their real base, right? It's not, they're happy to have the working class people who vote for them, but they aren't interested in giving them anything or even to really cultivating or building that power. they love, wealthy suburban voters who are trending more and more to the Democratic Party, and they can easily include them in that distribution, the redistribution model that they're setting up.
Here's this section here. The American left is in the grip of 3 illusions about domestic politics. In understanding U.S. politics, it is of utmost importance to grasp the electoral strategy of the Democratic Party. In this regard, 3 common illusions have plagued left analysis. The first is the notion that the obvious path to electoral success is to appeal to the American working class in class terms. And this is what the mistake people were making when they said, if they don't do this, then they're going to lose.
Yes.
Right. Like, and that's not like I guess we've seen like
I think,
go ahead.
No, I think this is a myth that like really needs to be dispelled, is that it's not that you can only win with, for example, a Bernie Sanders style, program. We've seen very clearly that that's not the case. The problem is that, one, it creates a perpetual situation where the Republicans can continue to build up that social base we're talking about, and it creates bad policy. It creates really dangerous policy because the social base they're interested in rewarding is not working class people. It's people at the top of society, which I think, again, like this is what makes the kind of left socialist analysis different from the CNN thing. Because if you watch people on CNN, it's how do you win this election, right? What can you put together to win this election? The socialist analysis is not just like how do you win the election, how do you build a coalition, a movement, a working class movement that can actually change and enact left-wing socialist policies. And very different kinds of analysis than we get oftentimes from those from like liberal Democratic Party pundits.
Yeah, and it says here, in fact, the question is not why the Democrats haven't won more seats, but why they have done so well in the last 3 cycles since 2018. The 2022 midterms, which seem, again, to have defied much common sense thinking, were successful by comparable historical standards. Yeah, I mean, that's something I think everybody needs to get up to speed on, whether you support, participation alongside Democrats in electoral strategy or not. At least understand that they're fucking winning.
Yeah. Well, as is typical of Left Reckoning, the opening segment,
I knew that was going to happen too.
went on a little bit longer, which I'm happy for. No, it's important stuff, and I want to do more on this. So
that piece was really the New Left Review piece. I haven't read the
I would love to get Dylan Riley on the podcast, though. He'd be one of those guests I'd be very nervous the whole time and might not be able to get anything out, but we should try to see if we can make that happen. Both that piece and the fault lines piece I thought was just phenomenal when it came out back in 2020, because sorry, we really should get going, but like I don't think there's been a lot of real theoretical analysis of Biden and Bidenism. And I think it's really important for us to be able to understand what's going on here. If we want to, I don't know, like I've been feeling that Marx quote recently, his talking about theses, his thesis 11, right? Philosophers up until now have interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Right. I've been feeling that more and more. And I think that, we need to go back to that spirit of analysis and critique, not just us at Left Reckoning, but on the left, because, there's a lot of just like, this is bad. It's like, fine. But like politics we have to move past a place on the left where we're not just, sort of designating good and bad things and trying to understand what the conditions are so that we can find a way out of this fucking crisis that we're in, so that people aren't dying of preventable disease, so that people aren't struggling to put food on their table, so that we don't see more and more barbarism coming from the right wing and utilizing the full powers of the state in our name to brutalize people domestically and internationally, right? Like the stakes are fucking high. And, I think so much of the left project in the contemporary moment has been just like, we are witnessing evil and are going to tell you what is good and what is bad. And it's like, I'm so uninterested in that, in that at this point. I'm not saying that I don't get don't get fired up about brutality and barbarism, But at a certain point, it's like we know how fucked up things are. The point has to be to figure out a way to change these and move past them.
Yeah, it's like bearing witness is good, but it can't be like the sole
I'm done with it.
task. Yeah.
And the funniest thing too is like, again, we gotta move on, but like you look at like Russian left before like the Social Democrats, for people who aren't familiar, Social Democrats become the Bolsheviks or split, and Lenin's side becomes the Bolsheviks. You had all these weird kind of apocalyptic like left cults that were like the Tsar's bad, early capitalism is bad, all this kind of stuff. But it was like very like spiritual in the sense of like it was like about the soul and recognizing the evil that is being brought into the world, rather than saying, okay, well, things are bad, how are we going to do something about it? And it's just funny, as oftentimes as you learn when you read history, it's just like, damn, these trends and tendencies have always been here. With us. But anyways, to get to our interview, we're going to have we have Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer at Jacobin, to talk about the Twitter files. It was a really interesting conversation. I was very happy to be able to have that with him. Matt and I will come back after that for probably a quick recap, and then we'll be going to the post game. You get access to that patreon.com/leftreckoning. Don't forget to join us in New York City. New York City. Have you ever seen that?
The what?
You haven't seen that? What We Do in the Shadows? Fuck, I can't remember the guy's name. We're going to be in New York City on January 22nd with Ben Burgess, Jason Miles, Sam Cedar, Emma Vigland, Bhaskar Sankara. You can get tickets now. They're selling pretty quick, so especially if you want to get there for the meet and greet, try to grab those soon. Really looking forward to that. And yeah, let's get to Branko.
Yep, here you go, folks. We'll see you in about 30 minutes.
Welcome back, everybody. David here for Left Reckoning. Matt Leck was not able to join us. He told me he does not respect free speech. He was messing around. But stoked to be joined today by Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer at Jacobin Magazine. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for taking this seriously.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to have you on because a couple weeks back, Matt and I did a kind of impromptu segment, just sort of off the cuff, because Matt used to work with Matt Taibbi back in the day. And we were talking about some of the journalism ethics regarding these Twitter files and what we were thinking about Matt Taibbi. But looking back at it, while I definitely agree with everything that we said, I think that it was worthwhile taking some time to talk about the Twitter files, what they actually said, what they represent, and how the left should be thinking about them. Because, there's really a couple of different narratives I think people can get from this recent these recent Twitter files. And, one of them is the fact that there seems to be a lot of government interest in involving themselves in social media and, these platforms. And there's a second one, which we can maybe get into later, about how maybe, there's ulterior motives, certain things are being highlighted over others. And I think now looking back at it, like that second bit has almost dominated completely these leaks. And I think you'd be the perfect person to come and talk about this. I linked to it in the show notes for everybody, but Branko wrote a great piece in Jacobin called Why the Twitter Files Are in Fact a Big Deal. So maybe just to start us off, could you sort of give us the zoomed out picture of why you find these, these revelations to be such a significant thing?
Yeah, let me just preface by just saying that, I totally understand people's reluctance or even, hostility to I guess, taking this stuff seriously or reading through it. I think the way that it's been reported, the various decision-making involved in getting this to the public, it's all kind of been, if you wanted to design a way to make, at least one half of the political spectrum completely ignore this and not take it seriously and think it's all a bunch of nonsense, then you couldn't have done a better job with the way it's been done. But I do think that if we can sort of put that stuff to the side and actually look at what is actually in there, not just in the various reporting that the people involved have done, but in the actual, the screenshots that were being given of emails and behind the scenes documents, there is a lot of stuff that should be alarming to all of us, and particularly the left. Number one for me, I think, any time that the FBI and the CIA, let alone a panoply of other national security alphabet agencies, the DHS, DNI, so on and so forth, are getting involved in something, it should be a big deal for us. Not only do these agencies have long, well-documented histories of all sorts of abuses, and particularly towards the left, and not even ancient ones, but very recent histories. I mean, the DHS was, of course, in 2020, deeply involved in all the anti-protester stuff that we were seeing that Trump was launching against anti-police brutality protests around the country. Kidnapping people off the streets, spying, crossing constitutional lines in order to surveil people, so on and so forth. So I think anytime that happens, we should be deeply concerned. And I think in this case, we have very specific reasons to, because what these files and other documents have shown is that the FBI, and the FBI, it's made clear in these documents, is basically considered a by proxy, the entire intelligence community. Because it's feeding all this information to those agencies, and those agencies are also feeding information to Twitter through the FBI, and that's what Twitter itself says. It says, basically, if we give stuff to the FBI, it's going to the intelligence agencies. They're involved in sending, according to the people reporting on this, hundreds of cases of accounts that have to be banned or suspended or shadow banned, every week. They're meeting weekly and monthly with Twitter executives, as well as executives of other social media platforms, to talk about, potential threats, at least as they define them. And I'm sure that the way that the FBI and various national security agencies define threats and misinformation is wildly different to how we, the rest of the public, might think about it, let alone people on the left. They are sending, Excel spreadsheets with thousands of accounts that are to be banned, or at least considered to be banned. We see the FBI repeatedly pressuring Twitter to crack down on foreign influence, supposedly, even though Twitter itself, these executives say to the FBI, well, we've looked at the accounts and various things that you've seen over, and we don't actually see any foreign influence. These are all domestic accounts, domestic accounts that maybe have opinions that you don't agree with, but they're domestic accounts. So, the involvement of the national security state and the way that these two broad sectors are kind of quietly coming together, that I think is the most alarming thing. I mean, we should try and remember that back before 2016, before Trump got elected, and people certainly on the liberal side had this huge panic about misinformation online, and decided that was the reason why all these political ruptures were happening all over the world. Before that happened, liberals and people on the left were vehemently against this kind of censorship. At the time, the justification was something that it was terrorism. It was ISIS. It was that kind of thing. People quite rightly said, well, hold on, we don't like these terrorists or what they're doing, but that should not be a reason to hand control over, what is technically, at least in theory, a communal public square over to the government to censor and manipulate as it would. So that's one. I mean, there's other revelations in there, but I really think, if we're going to focus on one thing, that particular point about the national security state is various intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies kind of becoming deeper and deeper enmeshed in not just Twitter, but all kinds of different social media companies. That is a really alarming thing. And no one on the left should be saying, oh, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to zoom it out too much, but this is one thing that I think and you've been covering this on a lot of different angles in the past few years, that has been so frightening about the quote unquote fake news and disinformation stuff, is that there was this real clamoring, particularly on the center left, for there to be action against disinformation. And while I don't want the news cycle to be rife with false stories and things like that, the question is always going to be, well, who's doing it? Who's deciding what is legitimate and what is not? And we've seen, for example, with the Russia disinformation stuff, that was very quickly utilized to attack the left, right? When Facebook changed, I think it was like 2017, Facebook really invited in a lot of fact checkers. They changed their algorithms to sort of deboost like misinformation or questionable information. Basically what that meant was people like Tariq Ali in the UK, publications like Counterpunch, were basically seeing their traffic drop to zero on Facebook at a time when that became like the number one place to publish news. And, with this, I think one thing that's really frightening about it is when you look at some of the examples that you saw in your piece that have been sort of revealed, is that the FBI has gotten pretty skilled at looking at the kind of terms of service of Twitter to flag things that like might not really rot, like they won't pass the smell test, but they could maybe have some kind of reasoning on the Twitter side to suppress something or ban it, which basically gives the FBI a lot of power to censor and decide what things we are able to talk about in the public, the quote unquote public square.
Yeah, absolutely. And Taibbi highlights in one of his Twitter threads, that Jim Baker, who used to be general counsel for the FBI, now an attorney at Twitter, which, by the way, is not a unique trajectory. Even before this came out, actually, Alan McLeod of Minpress News did a series of really good reports where he looked at, who all these various social media companies were hiring. And so many people, sometimes people directly involved in the area of content moderation, were people from the FBI, the CIA, DHS, NATO, so this is known before then, but there is increasingly a pipeline of people going from the FBI and other agencies to Twitter. Anyway, what does Baker say at one point? He says, even he finds it weird that the FBI is looking actively for terms of service violations. The idea that the reason why the FBI is involved in this is because the issue of foreign influence operations via things like Twitter and other social media companies is supposed to be so rife, number one, and then number two, alarming and dangerous that you have to make this all these different task forces. The DHS has its foreign influence task force through which the FBI and others work with Twitter to stop this. And it seems like they're just basically kind of looking for something to censor. And it would be bad enough. I think, given the various biases of people who are more likely to work in law enforcement and given the FBI's history, that would be bad anyway. But I think anytime anyone's kind of like looking for something to justify their job effectively, particularly when it's in the area of national security and threats, that never really tends to go well. I'd remind people that the FBI, one of the things it has a history of that we may have forgotten, in the post-Trump era, is that for many years during the war on terror, what was the FBI doing? Couldn't find actual terrorist threats that I had to deal with all this new personnel and new funding and new resources. So what did it do? It would entrap Muslim men, usually, poor or down on their luck, mentally ill, sometimes even just intellectually disabled Muslim men, and kind of create the threats that then justified all these, fancy new powers and sub-agencies and the like that have been created for the war on terror. And there's a little bit of that coming through in this, I think, as well, and some of those terms of searches violations and the Bureau basically getting back to Twitter when they say, well, we haven't found any foreign influence stuff, or these are all domestic accounts, and saying, well, hold on, you should look again, try harder. I'm sure you can find it.
And like, let's be very, clear about this. What we're talking about, you note in your piece that some of these news articles and things that were being flagged by the FBI to Twitter were things surrounding, for example, like the George Floyd protests, right? Saying that like, there might be a foreign hand in here trying to incite, people's anger at the fact that we live in a brutal police state, right? Like, this is some really high level stuff in its effects on domestic politics, right? This is stuff like people are out on the streets, they're seeing revelations about the way the police departments are handling themselves, and the FBI is trying to get Twitter to pull information off of their website because, basically encouraging them to see, maybe you can find, a Russian bot account that has been sort of promoting this kind of information.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really cover this in the piece because it was so long. You have to make cuts. But one of the interesting things that I found, looking through all these threads. I mean, by the way, I wish all this stuff was more public or shared with a wider circle of journalists. But we got to work with what we can. But one of the things that's evident is that the FBI is kind of, and other government agencies that are involved in this stuff, kind of relying or being prodded by stuff they read in the news. So when there was this explosion of in my estimation, pretty hysterical and over the top reporting about the power of Russian bots and trolls and all this kind of stuff after 2016. They were reading this stuff and taking it seriously. I mean, people on like us on the left are saying, well, hold on, I mean, maybe the stuff probably exists. Every government does this stuff, number one. But is it really the reason why black voters didn't come out to vote for Hillary Clinton? Is it really the reason why people are angry at Wall Street and don't like fracking and so on and so forth? We raised some of those questions. Clearly, people in the FBI did not, and they read this stuff and it kind of drove some of their decision making. So there's this feedback loop that's constantly happening. It seems like to me, based on the documents that we've seen so far.
So just technically, I mean, could you talk a little bit about how embedded the government has been with Twitter, like what their communication has been like, the kind of presence of like the FBI and these government agencies within like Twitter's decision-making process?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, they were meeting in advance of the election monthly and then weekly, and this was not just the FBI, but you have the CIA, which, by the way, the CIA is technically not meant to be involved in domestic operations, and yet here they are, under the nominal aegis of I'm sorry,
no worries,
a phone call, under the aegis of foreign influence, combating foreign influence. It turns out they're actually censoring domestic accounts, people who aren't in any way linked to foreign operations. They're just people who, again, might have bad or wrong political opinions, but they're entitled to have those in a democracy. So there's a lot of that going on. I mean, there was stuff they were talking about in the lead up to the election. We're going to give some of you temporary security clearances. At one point, they talk about information sharing, sharing classified information. A Twitter person says, is there any impediments to this? And the FBI says, no, there's no impediments to all this. I mean, there was a portal. We found out from some of these documents where the FBI could directly just send links to that portal and say, we want this account to be throttled, or we think this account should be banned, or we think this should be censored, so on and so forth. So it's a very, very intimate relationship. But I mean, earlier, thanks to Lee Fang of The Intercept, he reported all these documents that were released as part of a lawsuit against social media companies for some of this perceived kind of anti-conservative bias in censorship. And one of the things that we found out was that there's also a portal for Facebook that the FBI uses to again just feed links there and say, well, we think its reach needs to be throttled or whatever. So it's even the Twitter executives themselves at one point talk about what we're getting from the national security establishment. It's starting to kind of bring up issues of a state-controlled media here. Those are not my words. That's Twitter's own words.
Yeah, and in a little bit, I want to talk about this kind of filter of conservative or anti-conservative bias or pro-liberal bias or whatever. But before we get there, I think that last bit that you got to is really important to continue to highlighting, particularly for leftist people who are worried about the actions of the United States abroad. There's all this talk domestically about international interference, but they basically go as far as to admit that the United States is doing these kind of operations abroad, and those were purposefully not flagged as government propaganda, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's right. That was Lee Fang again who reported on that. He got access eventually to some of the Twitter documents, and that was one of the things he found. And we had some indication of that beforehand. There was actually a couple of recent studies that came out maybe a month or two before all this happened, that looked at some of the online discourse around the war in Ukraine and a variety of geopolitical topics. And it found that, it was the kind of Western-based or pro-Western narratives that were the most active in terms of, bots and trolls and the like, which isn't really surprising. I mean, you're talking about the most powerful country in the world. All these tech companies are located inside of the United States. They have close connection to political elites in the US. I mean, the Twitter and Facebook and all those companies, they don't hire and deal with the Russian government, nearly as intimate a basis as they do with the US. So it makes sense. But yeah, we had some indication that, the most kind of powerful and influential influence operations weren't really the ones being carried out by U.S. adversaries. They were the ones that's being carried out by the U.S. government, and this really kind of gave some very specific examples. There's a bunch of accounts that the Pentagon was surreptitiously running in the Middle East that was meant to shape public opinion, including one that was put out information about drone strikes in Yemen and basically said they're all good, they're great. All the right people are dying. We're not accidentally killing any villagers or the like, which of course is extremely dubious to say the least. And the Pentagon emailed Twitter and they said, hey, we noticed you blocked some of these. We actually need, we rely on these, and they were getting some traction. So can you please put them back in? Because it would be good to be able to keep doing what we've been doing. And so, these accounts, they weren't, I think, active at this point, but for years they were active. They weren't labeled, unlike other state-owned or state-controlled propaganda when it's non-US countries. Those are always very diligently labeled. In this case, they weren't. So not only did they get to keep staying up and continue to kind of spread propaganda on a without being disadvantaged by Twitter's various kind of control methods, but they were also not even being transparent about what they were.
So in the last couple of minutes, I mean, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, because I think on the left in particular, and center left is one thing. And just being honest, I'm not engaged in those conversations. I don't feel very much space to influence the worldview of the MSNBC watcher. But on our side, Jackman readers, leftist, socialist, people who voted for Bernie Sanders, there has, in my opinion, just been a big collective shrug on this this story. And I think part of it is about the fact that who were the people who it was given to. I'll just put my own opinion on here that I think that Matt Taibbi said it right when he said a couple years ago, once people start handing you stuff to print, you've sort of lost. That has sort of been the fixation, along with the fact that it's created this kind of grievance stories. Conservatives are being silenced in the national media. They're not being heard. And, all these media companies have like a pro-Biden left liberal agenda. And I think, in your piece, you note that, Taibbi hasn't really focused, for example, on, pro-Palestinian accounts that are being throttled. But this focus, I think, on like, is this going to help conservatives? And, again, like if you watch the CNN reports on this, it's like Charlie Kirk yelling about how he's being silenced, right? Mm-hmm. So even the most of the coverage has been like, are conservatives being silenced, instead of what I think the bigger story is, that like the United States government is playing an active role in deciding what information is good information versus what information is bad information. But if you want to make your pitch to folks about how they can sort of cut through these things without ignoring the fact that I think that there is a spectacle purposely being created to sort of rile up a more conservative base for Musk and Twitter for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just because the examples that have been picked, I mean, these largely went to conservative writers who naturally have picked out examples of right-wing accounts being censored. But the idea that just because those are the examples that have been picked out, that's all that's happening. It's actually, in many ways, it's a weirdly, you're falling into confirming what I think is a very mistaken and wrong belief by conservatives that they are being uniquely persecuted under these social media platforms. If you don't think that conservatives are actually, being persecuted more than others, than the left, then if the FBI is sending over, 200 cases a day, thousands of accounts, then you have to assume that some of those, at least some of those, are going to be people who aren't right wing and who, in fact, are left wing. I mean, not long after the Twitter files came out, there was a Palestinian journalist who was suspended, I think, on December 3rd. He had no idea why it even happened. And we've seen countless examples like that. So to me, it strains credulity to believe that there isn't a bunch of left-wing accounts that have been targeted. And we have examples of them even in the files. Number two, I mean, even if we grant that, let's say, people are now correct, conservatives are right, it's only they and they alone who are being censored on social media, and therefore the left shouldn't worry about it. I think that's a very foolish way to think about it. I mean, the reason why censorship, whether by the state or others, has historically been opposed by the left, is not because they agree with the people who are being censored. Often the people who are censored to begin with are the most fringe and extreme elements. Because that's the easiest thing to justify. That's the case with terrorism during the war on terror, where not just censorship, but a wide variety of civil liberties violations were justified on the basis of, well, look, these are bad people. Look at all the things that they believe and they say and they do. These people don't deserve our rights. But the point of it was that we understood that, okay, well, it'll start with people who are terrorists, but then, well, what is a terrorist? Who defines what a terrorist is? And second of all, what if it starts creeping into legitimate political discourse, into legitimate dissidents who, don't kill people or blow up buildings and the like, but maybe share certain foreign policy critiques or other critiques with some of these groups, and then it'll keep creeping and creeping and creeping. So just because it may be conservatives that are being targeted now, and I don't think that is true at all, but this is what people seem to believe. Just because they may be targeted now does not mean that they won't be targeted in the future. Just as, one of the revelations that happened later on was that the Biden White House had directly pressured Twitter to ban a bunch of, anti-vaccine and kind of anti-pandemic mitigation accounts, like Alex Berenson, for instance. Now, look, I don't sympathize with those people. I disagree with them. I don't share their views at all. But I mean, it doesn't take a lot of forethought for me to imagine if you allow that precedent to stand, well, what's going to happen when Donald Trump goes back to the White House, or Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, or someone. I mean, if they can decide, hey, this is disinformation, and this is dangerous speech, you can't have it on there. We're going to lean on you until you get rid of it. If the Biden White House can do that, we just go along with it when we say that's fine because we don't agree with these people. Well, it's not going to. By the time that DeSantis is pressuring Twitter to kick off a bunch of left-wing accounts and all manner of other things, by that point it'll be too late for you to mount any sort of opposition. I think you've got to start now.
And so like there's a political point which I think is a good one, and it's would you be comfortable with DeSantis playing this role? Would you be comfortable with Trump playing this role? I think the answer should be no to that. But on the private company side too. Right, you note in your piece that like there's also, and I actually think this is a very likely result of all this, and probably even a purposeful one. Like, why is Musk wanting to do this? Right. Well, what are Musk's things? Musk is worried that the woke mind virus is destroying American society, and he understands that Twitter is a very important tool for his bottom line, right? Because most of his companies are sort of based on his public persona. And what if Twitter starts internally like overcorrecting? As you note in your piece, hiring more conservative people to sort of decide what is not misinformation. And, if you see basically like the way that this has been sort of brought out so far does sort of create this excuse that like, oh, Twitter is this super left-wing thing. So in the dreams and hopes of a fair and balanced conversation, we're going to start coming down a little bit harder on the left. that could be something that's really dangerous. And it makes it even more dangerous if people aren't recognizing in the moment right now that this is a bad power for a private company to have. This is a bad tendency for people to accept the government involving themselves in community discussion like this. I'm just curious to sort of close out what your thoughts are on that kind of private overreaction and maybe some of the motives as to why. I mean, I think that this is there's some really juicy stuff in here, right? I think that it's very helpful if you do have let's say Musk has these kind of bad intentions. This is a great way to sort of create a situation where everyone's like, oh, see, this is a right-wing thing. We're not going to be worried about it. And then sort of allows Musk to use this as an excuse to sort of clamp down in the future.
Yeah, I mean, what you said is precisely correct. The reason why governments have constitutions, the reason why governments have laws, the reason why the US has the First Amendment is because we understand that governments change hands. And so you may like this one person who's in power right now, but at some point they're going to change over to someone else, and you may not like them. And if you are happy to have them have certain tyrannical powers or very strong kind of ability to override speech and civil liberties and the like, that's maybe fine for 4 years, but what about the next guy? And it's the same with private companies. Private companies change ownership. I mean, that's why Elon Musk is now the CEO of Twitter and why we've gotten this, 2 months of chaos. And just because Musk is gone does not mean that Twitter won't at some point, the next CEO won't go, hey, you know what, maybe to avoid some of this public furor, let's overcorrect and show that actually we're not biased towards conservatives. I mean, when Reddit famously purged itself of all these pro-Trump accounts under pressure, it also purged itself of a bunch of left-wing, it's not accounts, sorry, subreddit pages. It also purged itself of a bunch of left-wing subreddits that were in no way offensive or hateful or anything, but they wanted to show, hey, you know what, we're not going after the right. We're equal opportunity offenders. Companies do that kind of stuff all the time. It's not even hard to imagine a bunch of other scenarios. Let's say that the Republicans who now control Congress, they decide, hey, you know what, this worked really well for the Democrats. And we've been wanting to quash, what we consider dangerous speech on social media for years, going back to the war on terror. Well, what if we do what the Democrats do now? We're going to haul tech executives before Congress. We're going to grill them. We're going to threaten them with, law changes and the like that will make censorship inevitable, and then basically threaten them and cajole them into getting rid of the kind of speech that we like. Maybe they'll get rid of some pro-Palestinian accounts and pages. Maybe they'll get rid of some accounts and pages that appear to be too friendly towards the Chinese government and are not sufficiently pro-war enough. Maybe they'll get rid of people who are advising certain pandemic mitigation techniques or wearing masks and so on and so forth. You can imagine a million different scenarios. And just one other thing I would just caution as well, it's fair to speculate and to talk about the motives of Musk and releasing this and everything. I think that's totally fair game. I think that focusing on that and using that as a reason to just dismiss all that stuff is really short-sighted and mistaken. And in fact, it's the exact thing that unfortunately every side does when it's a leak that is perceived by a particular faction as being in some way politically inconvenient or otherwise. They always focus on the motives and the personality of the person who leaked it and who reported it, instead of the actual disclosures themselves. I've seen this happen so many times. I mean, of course, in the Pentagon Papers. Yeah, happened with Snowden. It happened in 2016 when we were told, hey, we should avoid all the genuinely scandalous stuff in the Clinton emails because Russia is behind this and they want us to talk about this stuff. And I think most of the left at the time quite correctly said, who gives a damn what Russia's motive was? Who gives a damn what the Kremlin wanted? The point is this true? And is this newsworthy? And in that case, both were true. And it's true in this case as well. So I think, yes, have that in mind, of course. I'm not saying dismiss it, but I really think it doesn't make sense to start using the excuse of, Democrats in 2016, the national security state in 2013 to dismiss this stuff.
Yeah, I know. I think that's put exactly right. It's like you can have these things in mind as, you could have in, for example, with the the Clinton emails, but no reason in heaven should you say, hey, it's not scandalous that they're conspiring to deny the results of this primary, or in this case, should you be able to dismiss the fact that the FBI has taken a lot of interest in your Twitter activity. Branko, I really appreciate you taking the time. Folks, there are links below to find Branko's work. Branko's one of those journalists, whenever you see his name, you should definitely click and read his work. It's always very insightful. Thanks so much, man.
That was very kind.
Yeah, man.
Branko, that was a great talk. My apologies for not being there with you guys.
It's all good, man. Yeah, no, I mean, no, I wish you had been there, because like, Branko's one of those people who you can push a little bit, and he always has a response. I was saying though, like, to him, it's like we should get him on to, because we've had him on to talk Ukraine and Twitter. We should get him on with something that's a little bit less controversial on the left, so he can get the adoration that he deserves, because he is a phenomenal voice. And like, the term free thinker is a little annoying, but like, he's somebody who's not afraid to sort of take a stand or make a point that some people are afraid to make.
Yeah, he's the sort of person on the left that, like, I mean, a lot of,
and he's also willing to like do the tedious shit that like like you and I are done with.
That's the thing, is because like I do think like one of the most remedial lessons in media literacy is, why is this news on the newspaper? Like the New York Times and Politico, they're just like free-flowing, inquisitive places where there's always an agenda for stuff getting out. I do think that's important to foreground this. But that said, like, and what's frustrating about it is the impression that's caused by, I mean, especially the way Elon, you can always tell the spin Elon likes to throw when he quote tweets like a new Taibbi thread, where he throws an extra little sauce on there that's not really justified by the actual thread. And the problem is, like, it is creating this impression that it's like, that we have to like argue that the left is being censored. Like, if we all know this shit has been happening for a long time with regards to like deboosting. I mean, fucking Jake Flores, the comedian, got a FBI visit at his house. That's what's frustrating about the sort of non-participation in the left and the way that the right participates in it, is that impression.
I think the real highlight, I was saying this to you before we went live, is that, when the first couple drops happened, I was like, whatever, I mean, some interesting stuff. It was interesting to see how Twitter's operating, but like, it was very much like, how's the right being fucked up by Twitter? But when Li Fong and like, Lee's people have their criticisms of him or whatever.
Yes, I disagree with certain of his takes. Yeah, but
but at the same time too, like, he is somebody who does like a lot of really great journalism,
right?
And sometimes it's good to be able to compartmentalize between take havers and journalists on that level. But I remember texting you when his report at The Intercept came out. So it's like, oh, this actually seems a little bit more serious. And that was the ones where you're seeing a lot more about the FBI involvement, particularly around like the George Floyd stuff. And, Matt, like, it feels like this forever ago, but, before I met you and Michael and was doing all this kind of stuff, I was just a kind of broke guy trying to put some pieces out there. And I ended up on one of those crazy lists from the Proper Not people. I don't know if people remember that, but there's just like insane group of people go on Twitter and buy a website and start saying, we know who are the Russian paid journalists and who, we know who the Russian paid journalists are in this country. And they started circulating this list. And the Washington Post published that list without any verification or anything behind it. And, a lot of people were on it. I was on it. And it was insane. Because at that point, by the way, like, I was nobody. I'd written like 2 pieces for Counterpunch or something at that point. And one was just like, I thought that the spectacle around the bombing of Syria by Trump was tasteless. the way that the media was covering it, and another one about how capitalism is rigged against workers, right? Like nothing even particularly controversial, but it was a really frightening moment. And recognizing that like that all started with these demands when Trump gets elected, that fake news is taking over. We have to do something about fake news, and not having very much care as to what that is actually going to mean in practice. And we saw what that ended up meaning in practice. In Facebook, that meant that Tariq Ali was getting, deboosted. That means a lot of other independent media people were getting deboosted. Like really, really consequential stuff, and to dealing with the crisis of fake news, like not very effective, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like we got to be, and the same thing with the Russian like allegiance stuff, when everybody was acting like, oh, criticism of America has to have these kind of nefarious or like a puppet master behind it, instead of the fact that this is a country that's extremely brutal and people are rightfully upset. I mean, even people on the left is not the word I want to use for them, like Democratic Party voters and pundits and things like that, were saying that about the George Floyd protests, and it was a really wild moment to see. It's like, oh, this is how that kind of thing can happen in a country, where like a story sort of captivates the imagination of folks, that they'll just sort of accept anything. And I think like we have to be disciplined about it, because of course the charlatans and the right love these kind of things. Charlie Kirk, every time he's been on CNN, like you could see how happy he is to be able to go on there and be like, I've been deboosted. Or, that's not good Charlie Kirk, that's a more Alex Jones. But they love this kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, recognize the fraud that they're trying to do, but don't also fall into the trap of not being able to recognize that these things are worrying. And not to talk too much, Matt, because I'm curious what you think about this. I hear people all the time saying like, well, I already knew this, right? Or I suspected that Twitter was up to this. It's like, fine. Yeah. When like we find out another police department is racist, do we sort of say, well, I know police departments are racist? Like, no. In fact, like if your suspicions are being answered and proven, that should be vindicating, and something that you should be, propagating. Like, look, I've thought this for a long time. Here's some like cold hard facts about how this is happening. I don't understand that argument at all.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things on that. Part of it is there was reporting on, and Branko mentioned the Alan McLeod Mint Press News stuff. There's other reporting on these operations that this isn't an entire. I understand, and let me just say real quick, like the point is not to be like I knew all this, but just go back and refresh people on the people who did that reporting, earlier, and take it as okay, the attention has been turned to this subject, because I think it's mainly like I think certain people are like the people that are tuned in are like annoyed that their concern is being echoed back by bad actors, and I do get that, but I do think, like you said, like the response is just to say like, okay, like these certain things were revealed with this sort of operation. I can't remember which operation it was, but
no, and also Twitter's done this before, by the way.
Right.
They have released documents about their processes before. They did that before Musk. I think that there's something to be said about the way that these have been put out and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of it does rise to like nothing burger kind of things.
Well, that's what else was frustrating, is it'd be nice to like the Snowden leaks, where it seemed like there was a little bit of process and like rumination, even like maybe I'm misremembering that time. It was a while ago, but it's like this stuff. Like it's like when
are you talking about the leaks, the file. Sorry,
the way the leaks were like processed and reported out by journalists, right? Whereas this, it's like different Twitter like threads each fucking day, and there's no seemingly emphasis about. We started off like talking about, I mean, certain things that I really don't give a fuck about the Hunter laptop thing. I think it's pretty clear like that was a politically motivated thing, but I don't think that's like as interesting as this FBI stuff is, right? Like I think that's like, I honestly think the Hunter Biden story has been like, I don't think it's as interesting.
The Hunter Biden story is a non-story. I think I maybe we disagree on this, but I do think involving themselves in the way that they did makes it like only amplified its kind of importance.
Absolutely. But I also think like acting as if it was just a clear like I think the Russiagate stuff does warp all of this, and that is the context that it's being done in. That said, like, where the fuck did those files come from? Like, the chain of title on that seems super weird to me. Like, oh, Rudy Giuliani found some files, and then like all that stuff happening right before an election. Like, I honestly, like, I don't know, like. I'm saying this in context of someone like that believes pretty conspiratorial things about Reagan getting into office, like things that come in that launch right before an election. Like, I don't know what the proper response is, like with regards to like Iran. Like, I don't know what the proper response is a state has to that. But like, that's why the Hunter Biden stuff, like, I do agree. It's like, it was ridiculous that they said this is hacked stuff when it wasn't clear it was. At the same time, it's like, who the fuck knows? All right. So it's like, that is way less interesting to me than the FBI getting involved with regard and the shaping of public consciousness about different theaters of war, conflict that the military is operating in. That is real shit to me. Then to me, which is more of like yes, we have all this shit privatized. We have private communications companies that is pretty important to how society functions, and there's going to be some tension with the political parties on that. It's not that interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worrying to know that the Biden campaign is being able to call in, not just because it's the Biden campaign, because it could just be any kind of campaign, and like setting that precedent is something that makes me uncomfortable. Beyond that, like, the thing about the way that these were released, I think disastrous, and I think by design. There is no doubt about it that there is stuff that is not out. I mean, no doubt.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no doubt. Like, this stuff was curated.
It'd be stupid to not think so.
If people remember, everybody was having a field day making fun of Barry Weiss. I can't remember what it was that she was putting out there, but it's like, Barry Weiss doesn't know how to screenshot on her phone, because she was just posting things that were very clearly taken from an iPhone camera off of a computer screen, right? Everyone's roasting from. It's like, well, it actually turns out that they were getting that from a Twitter executive. So Barry Weiss was asking a Twitter executive with certain privileges to go and look at certain things, and they were taking photographs for her. I bring that up just to say, like, so the leaks that were coming out were things that were curated. That doesn't mean that what came out is wrong or incorrect. It means that it's not like you're actually swimming through all the information kind of situation. And not that I think Barry Weiss or even Taibbi would have been pulling other kind of things than they ended up doing. But the point is, like, this was like a moderated investigation, right? So like, and it's put out in a certain way. I think the argument that, like, the fact that, like, the FBI stuff comes out way later than the, oh my God, I can't even remember who the right wing folks Charlie Kirk or whatever, right? Were getting deboosted. Like, by the time the FBI stuff came out, I think everyone was sort of exhausted with the story. I think that's by design. Yeah, I think it's just like, these are things that, like, we have to just be able to be, smart about. There is a reason that they're coming out. I, like, honestly, my hot take on all this is, like, this is just all a setup for, and we've already seen it. It's not even something I think is going to happen in the future. Our friend Matt Bender got hit with this almost immediately. Yeah. That, like, Musk wants to take a more active role in sort of attacking left wing or accounts that are critical of him and all those folks.
Well, that's also why there's no charity to Taibbi and Greenwald, because they're just sitting there setting the predicate for that, and also they'll be there to do enough hemming and hawing, like, oh, I don't entirely support this, but also you had it coming, wink, yeah. Like, in parentheses. But yeah.
So what I'm saying is, like, you can recognize all that and also be like, hey, I think it's bad that the FBI is, like, playing an active role in deciding what is good information versus bad information on twitter.com, right? I think that we can be able to hold these things in our head at one time. And I don't know, just being honest, I get frustrated sometimes on our side that we sort of seem to be at times incapable of doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm less. I get annoyed. I'm glad that we do have people like Branko doing that work, because there's an impression trying to be created that's not being done. But I also, like, this is an op. Like, this isn't a genuine. This isn't like and I believe like Fong's intentions and like the actual journalists that they involved.
yeah.
But this is like I do think like it's impossible to discuss that, and I understand like people checking out because even if you don't think it's an op, or even if you're like us, semi curious about what they might actually surface to sort of justify all this hoopla, it's still difficult to read that shit and engage with it, in my opinion. And that includes today's, which maybe we'll react to in the future.
Yeah. Well, folks, we're going to jump over to the post game. We have some fun.
I'm gonna get pissed about a similar topic about the same kind of people talking about librarians. So we'll look forward to that.
I mean, Matt, I got to commend you. Your reporting on this has been actually really good. So we're going to be doing that in the post game, talking about how the kind of trans and rights panic from the right is being used for, I don't know, pretty typical right wing shit to wage war.
Good old enclosure, baby.
Yeah. We also have some stuff on everybody's. What's the term for him? Andrew Tate. We got some Andrew Tate shit. I have a great clip. I don't think you've seen this yet, Matt. We'll be talking about that. We'll be taking calls and questions. You can get access to that, patreon.com/leftreckoning. Did just want to appreciate this super chat from our friend MDR down in Australia. Happy New Year's to you. We're stoked for 100 next week. We'll have a bonus episode up this Sunday for patrons. Yeah, get access to that, patreon.com/leftreckoning. And don't forget, New York City, baby. January 22nd. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Coming up. It's under 3 weeks now.
I know. I was kidding.
Get better.
I'm glad I got all my shit figured out. I'm flying Southwest. I'm nervous.
Oh, well,
I'm sure he'll be settled by then.
David's going to be calling in from the airport lounge.
Oh man, that's a whole other thing. Another good example about like why we can't let fucking transportation be controlled by private corporations is really dangerous.
Come on, Brandon. Throw Buttigieg under the bus. Let's just do it, man. Like,
it's funny. Like Southwest has a pretty like HEB kind of status in Texas. HEB like probably bad corporation, does a lot of bad things, but grocery store beloved. I love HEB. Southwest has a similar feeling for a lot of folks. My mom actually, and when I knew someone was fucked up in this company, is somebody's lithium like backpack blew up on the plane next to my mom. And my mom is just like one of those people. She's like, she sees a problem, she deals with it. So she grabs the backpack and puts out the fire. And they didn't give her shit. They did like no condemnation. In fact, they yelled at her for putting out the fire on the plane. And that was my first red flag with Southwest. But anyway, we're not talking about Southwest in the post game, but I was just thinking about that. We'll be talking about Andrew Tate, this horrible right-wing trans thing, and some of the ulterior motives other than just straight up bigotry, taking calls and questions and everything else. So join us over at the post game, patreon.com/leftreckoning.
We will see you there, folks. There.